Hi, I'm glad you're here. Today's story isn't about a single crime or a headline that made national news. It's about something we all face but rarely talk about until it's staring us in the face. We're diving into the history of death, not just what happens when we die, but what happens after. The rituals, the traditions, the businesses, the industries that have turned our final goodbye into a billion-dollar empire. This isn't just a story about caskets and cremation. It's about memory money and the way we measure a life once it's over. Because the truth is, the way we treat death says a lot about how we value life. So get comfortable, take a breath, and let's take a quiet, honest look at what it really costs to be remembered. Chapter 1. The Second Death. I've been thinking about something lately, this idea that every person actually dies twice. The first time, of course, is when you take your last breath. But the second time, that's when your name is spoken for the very last time. And that second death, it lingers in my mind more than I care to admit. Because when you really sit with it, it's not just about the end of your life, it's the end of your memory, the end of your presence in this world, in anyone's thoughts. And that's terrifying in a way that feels deeper than death itself. Maybe that's why so many of us fear being forgotten more than we fear dying. That need to be remembered, to have left some kind of mark, it's woven into us. And it's not just modern people who feel that way. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Egyptians built entire monuments, the pyramids, for that very reason. To be remembered, to outlive their own breath. And honestly, it worked. We still talk about them today, but here in modern-day America, death doesn't look like eternal legacy. It's not about building pyramids or preserving your soul for the afterlife. No, death here is complicated, stressful, expensive. We've built an entire industry around it, one that rakes in billions every single year, an industry that knows at the end of the day everyone dies. And that certainty, it's profitable. When someone passes, there's this overwhelming pressure to do it the right way, to bury them in a fancy casket, to cremate them, and place their ashes in a sleek, costly urn. Somehow grief has been packaged and sold to us in neat, overpriced boxes. And it makes me wonder, does it have to be like this? Why is death treated like a luxury item in this country? Who decided that mourning should come with a price tag? And more importantly, who's actually profiting off of it all? So today, I want to talk about it. I want to take you through the history of death, not the spiritual kind, but the logistical, financial, and sometimes deeply disturbing ways that humans have dealt with dying. This is the story of how death became an industry, how grief turned into revenue, and how something so inevitable, so natural, has become one of the most manipulated and misunderstood parts of our lives. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Death Through the Ages, From Pyramids to Catacombs. If you think about it, every civilization has had to figure out what to do with the dead. There's no escaping it. No matter how different we are across time or geography, we've all had to face the same question: what happens when someone dies? And more importantly, how do we honor them? Or, how do we manage the mess they leave behind? Let's go way back to ancient Egypt. Now, the Egyptians didn't just think about death as an ending. To them, it was a transformation, a journey. That's why they practiced mummification. It wasn't some creepy, dramatic ritual just for the pharaohs. It was deeply spiritual. They believed preserving the body helped preserve the soul. The more intact the body, the better the soul's chances of making it safely to the afterlife. And while not everyone could afford a pyramid, the average Egyptian still found ways to show respect. They threw funerals, gathered in large numbers, and dressed as gods to honor the person who had passed. It was a community event. It was love. It was ritual. Now compare that to what came next after Rome went full Christian. Suddenly, a lot of those ancient traditions were considered pagan, even blasphemous. Cremation, which had been completely normal for the Greeks and Romans, was banned. Christians believed that the body had to be kept whole for resurrection, and that belief created a new problem. See, there wasn't enough space. Cities were growing, and graveyards were filling up fast. That's when the early Christians turned to catacombs, underground tunnels lined with the dead. Out of sight, out of mind. But the pagans didn't like that either. They saw these catacombs as a rejection of tradition, and some even destroyed them. So Christians started building them in secret. Now, I don't know about you, but building secret underground tunnels filled with corpses, that seems a lot more dramatic than cremation. But hey, I'm just here for the history. Eventually, that tradition made its way to Paris. And by the 1700s, the city had a full-on crisis. The largest cemetery, Holy Innocents, was overflowing. So in a move that seems almost too surreal to be true, they started digging up bones at night by torchlight and moving them to the catacombs. Imagine that. You're walking through the streets of Paris, and underneath your feet, millions of skeletons stacked wall to wall. Experts say there are around 6 million people buried in the Paris catacombs now. It's become a tourist attraction, but back then it was a desperate solution to a very real, very putrid problem. And that's the thing. Death wasn't just about honoring someone's soul anymore, it became about managing the physical consequences. The smell, the spread of disease, the politics of burial space. It's wild to think how far we've gone just to deal with what's inevitable. From gold-lined sarcophagi to hidden catacombs, from reverence to regulation. And yet, even now, we're still wrestling with the same questions. How do we honor the dead? How do we live with death without letting it poison the living? Those questions aren't just ancient, they're still with us. And in America, they started to take on a whole new meaning once colonists came into the picture. But I'll get to that in a minute. Chapter 3. Death in Early America, Simplicity Spirits, and Silent Goodbyes. So we've journeyed through ancient Egypt, through the Roman Empire, and into the catacombs of Paris. But when we shift focus to early America, death takes on a whole new flavor. It becomes quieter, harsher, and in many ways, more personal. Long before colonists ever stepped foot here, the indigenous peoples of North America had their own deep spiritual relationships with death. And what I found most fascinating was just how diverse their traditions were. Depending on the tribe, the approach to death could be entirely different. Some, like the Apache and Navajo, believed that the dead could become angry at the living. That if you didn't take precautions, a spirit might come back not to say goodbye, but to disrupt your life. Out of respect and fear, they would bury the dead, quickly burn the deceased's belongings, and even move homes altogether. They didn't want the spirit to find its way back. It was about protection, but also closure. Other tribes, like the Sioux, had a much more comforting view. They believed the spirits of the dead could actually guide and help the living. The connection didn't end with death, it evolved. They would speak to the dead, ask for advice, honor them with stories. It wasn't something to be feared. It was a relationship that continued. And then came the colonists. By the 1600s, European settlers had brought with them their own rituals shaped by religion, poverty, disease, and honestly, a whole lot of tragedy. Death was everywhere. Infant mortality rates were devastatingly high. 1/3 of children didn't make it to adulthood. And life expectancy? It was shockingly low. For many, if you lived past 30, you were considered lucky. So funerals out of necessity were simple. There was no time for pageantry or waiting. People died quickly, and they were buried quickly. But there was still a sense of community. The night before the burial, loved ones would gather to sit with the body, partly out of mourning and partly to make sure they were really dead. That sounds morbid, I know, but it was real. They wanted everyone to agree. Yes, this person has passed. No heartbeat, no breath. It was like group confirmation before a final goodbye. Then came the feast. People ate, drank, shared stories. Not to celebrate the death, but to honor the life. And yeah, sometimes they drank a lot. Rum was practically a requirement. Maybe it was a way to numb the grief, or maybe it was the only way to make it through another loss in a world where loss was so constant. It's kind of haunting to think about. Grief wasn't rare, it was normal, expected, routine. But what's even more interesting is that over time things started to shift. Funerals became competitive. People started giving out gifts at them, real gifts, like gold rings, scarves, expensive rum. It was like funerals became a statement of wealth and legacy. And it got so out of hand, the Massachusetts government had to pass a law in 1761 to limit how extravagant funerals could be. Imagine that legislating how fancy you're allowed to mourn, because people were literally going bankrupt just to bury someone with dignity. I think about that a lot. The idea that even in death, we're still performing, still trying to show status, still trying to leave an impression. It's humbling and a little sad, because in the beginning, funerals weren't about luxury. They were about presence, about being with each other in the face of something none of us can escape. And maybe that's what we've lost along the way. The quiet, the closeness, the simplicity of just saying goodbye. But that simplicity, it wouldn't last long, because soon America would be at war. And with war came a new challenge. How do you mourn the dead when the dead are thousands of miles away? We'll talk about that next. Chapter 4. The Civil War and the birth of embalming death changed in America when the war began. Before the Civil War, death still felt local. You lived, you died. Your family buried you. Simple, personal. But when soldiers started dying by the thousands on distant battlefields, far from home, far from family, that intimacy shattered. Imagine losing your son, your husband, your brother, and knowing he was buried in a shallow grave, hundreds of miles away sometimes without a name, sometimes never found at all. It was heartbreaking, and for the families left behind, it felt like a second kind of death, one that came with not knowing, not seeing, not saying goodbye. That's when embalming entered the picture. Now, embalming wasn't new in theory. The Egyptians had mastered it thousands of years earlier, but in America, it wasn't something people did. That is, until a man named Dr. Thomas Holmes came along. Holmes was a New York doctor who saw a need and an opportunity. He developed a method of injecting chemicals into the bloodstream of the deceased to preserve the body, slow decay, and this part is key, make it safe enough to send home on long train rides. And people paid for it. I mean, wouldn't you? If you had the chance to see your loved one one last time, to bury them near family, instead of imagining them left in some unknown field, that mattered. It still matters. Holmes claimed to have embalmed over 4,000 bodies during the war. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, everyone wanted in. Surgeons, undertakers, even random opportunists started offering professional embalming services. There were no regulations, no licenses, no standards. Just chemicals, money, and grief. Some of these so-called experts would show up on the battlefield, find fallen soldiers, embalm them on the spot, and then prop the bodies up, yes, literally like mannequins in shop windows, to show off their technique. It sounds grotesque, and it was, but this was advertising. This was business. Death had become a product. Eventually, the government had to step in. The War Department issued official licenses and price regulations because the industry was getting out of control. But by then, embalming had become something else. Entirely, it had become normal, expected. And then came Lincoln. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his body became the centerpiece of a historic funeral procession. He was embalmed so thoroughly that he was displayed for the public in city after city, from Washington, D.C., to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Tens of thousands of people came to see him, and for many, it was the first time they had ever seen an embalmed body. He still looked like Lincoln, and that left an impression. It was weirdly powerful, comforting even, as if death could be paused, as if the man still lingered in the room just long enough for people to say goodbye. And that more than the war, more than the science, was what made embalming stick. People didn't just want to bury their dead, they wanted to preserve them, to delay the final moment just a little bit longer, to make the goodbye feel more bearable. By the time Lincoln was buried, embalming was no longer a battlefield necessity, it was a cultural expectation. And in the years that followed, a new kind of business would begin to grow. Funeral homes, funeral directors, caskets lined with satin. Death was becoming polished, professional, and profitable, and it all started with a war that tore families apart, and the desperate need to bring them back together even just for a moment. But as death became a business, the price of saying goodbye would only go up from here. Chapter 5. The funeral industry is born after the Civil War. America was different. Not just politically or emotionally, but culturally. We had learned in the harshest way possible that death wasn't always something you could prepare for. And more importantly, that death had a price. Embalming, which started as a battlefield necessity, didn't just go away when the war ended. It stuck around. People had seen the benefits, how it helped bring a body home, how it made the goodbye feel more real, more human. But now that the war was over, embalming had to find a new role. And it did by becoming the foundation of a brand new industry. You see, before this point, funerals were handled mostly at home. The family washed and dressed the body. They held the wake in the front room. Neighbors came by to offer food and condolences. It was intimate, messy, personal. But with embalming came a new kind of need, one that required expertise, tools, and a place outside the home to get the job done. Families weren't prepared to handle chemicals or surgical instruments, and they didn't want to, honestly. So they turned to professionals. And just like that, the funeral director was born. By the 1880s, undertakers, what we now call morticians or funeral directors, were organizing. They formed the National Funeral Directors Association in 1882. And with it came standards, business models, and the slow but steady shift of death from something handled at home to something outsourced. This was the beginning of what I'd call the death industry. Suddenly, it wasn't just about helping families bury their dead. It was about offering packages, products, experiences. And just like any other growing industry, competition fueled innovation, but it also invited price tags. What used to be a handmade wooden box was now a polished casket lined with satin. What used to be a gathering in someone's living room was now a formal service in a designated funeral home with viewing rooms, organ music, and floral arrangements that cost more than your monthly rent. And in a way, it made sense. People were living longer. They had more money, and they wanted to honor their loved ones in a way that felt respectful, proper, worthy. But it also created a quiet pressure. If you didn't do the full service, the embalming, the casket with brass handles, it could feel like you were failing the person you lost, like you weren't honoring them enough. And that's where it started to get murky. Because grief is vulnerable. And in that space, when you're heartbroken and exhausted, it's very easy for someone to convince you that you need more. More flowers, a bigger headstone, a nicer suit, a premium casket. Because, well, didn't your loved one deserve the best? This emotional manipulation didn't come from nowhere. It came from a business model that saw death as something you could dress up, sell, and upsell. And the American funeral home was now the storefront. I think what's most unsettling about all this is how fast it happened. In less than a generation, the way we experienced death had been transformed. It went from a quiet family ritual to a full-blown commercial event. And no one really stopped to question it. Because in the moment when someone dies, you're not thinking about profit margins. You're thinking about loss. You're thinking about love. But someone else? They're thinking about how much you're willing to pay for both. And as the 20th century approached, one event would put that pricing and this entire new industry to the ultimate test, a deadly pandemic, and it would change everything. Again. Chapter 6. The Spanish Flu and the Business of Grief. There are moments in history that feel like they hit the pause button on life, and at the same time, fast forward everything we thought we understood. For the funeral industry, that moment was 1918. That year, the Spanish flu pandemic swept across the world like a ghost no one could outrun. It killed millions fast. No warning, no time to prepare. One day you had a cough, the next day you were gone. It was like death had stepped into everyone's home at once and refused to leave. Hospitals overflowed, families were terrified, and the funeral industry, it was completely overwhelmed. Everything we had built in the decades after the Civil War, the embalming techniques, the polished ceremonies, the beautiful caskets and carefully scheduled services, it all fell apart. There simply wasn't time. Not when people were dying in such high numbers that they couldn't even be buried properly. Embalming became a luxury again. And even that word luxury feels strange to use in the context of death, but it was true. There weren't enough embalmers. There weren't enough coffins. And more importantly, there weren't enough days. Many cities passed emergency laws banning public gatherings. That meant no funerals, no wakes, no goodbyes. Families weren't just losing their loved ones, they were losing the chance to mourn them. So the bodies piled up, sometimes in trucks, sometimes in makeshift morgues. Wooden coffins were slapped together as fast as they could be just to keep up. There was no time to plan, no time to process, no room for grief. And what's strange is, when it was all over, you'd think people would have wanted to simplify. You'd think maybe after all that loss, we'd go back to basics, quiet burials, private moments, just family. But that's not what happened. What happened was the opposite. After the pandemic, people were desperate to feel normal again. They wanted the rituals back. The ceremonies, the embalming, the flowers, the rows of chairs and the guest books and the organ music. It was like grief had been put on hold for too long, and when it returned, it came back with interest. The funeral industry, which many thought might collapse under the weight of the pandemic, actually grew stronger. People craved order after so much chaos. And the businesses that could provide it, they thrived. But that craving for control came with a cost. Suddenly, it wasn't just about preserving the dead, it was about preserving tradition, about having the right kind of funeral, the respectable kind, the kind that showed you cared. And like any industry, when demand goes up, so do prices. Caskets became more ornate, funeral homes expanded, services got longer, packages got pricier, and before long, death was no longer just a private tragedy, it was a financial burden. One that hit families at their most vulnerable moment. It's strange to think about how quickly we adjust to these systems. One generation mourns in silence, the next generation mourns with invoices, and yet I don't blame people for wanting something beautiful after something so devastating. I get it. When the world spins out of control, you want at least one part of it to feel put together, even if that part is the goodbye. But that's how the industry keeps growing, by filling in the cracks that grief leaves behind. And it wouldn't be long before another shift was coming, a quieter one that would challenge everything we thought we knew about burials, embalming, and the very idea of what happens to us after we die. Cremation was about to make a comeback, and it came with its own history, its own controversy, and its own price tag. Chapter 7: Fire Fluids and the Cost of Saying Goodbye. You know, for a country that treats death like a business, we're oddly indecisive about what to actually do with our dead. By the time the Spanish flu faded, Americans had fully embraced the modern funeral. Embalming formal services, lavish caskets, those became the norm. But beneath the polished surface, there were cracks forming. Doubts, questions, whispers that maybe, just maybe. Embalming wasn't the perfect solution after all. It started with the science. In the late 1800s, a doctor named Francis Julius Lemoyne began publicly criticizing the practice of embalming. He didn't think it was just unnecessary, he thought it was dangerous. According to him, the chemicals being used, especially formaldehyde, weren't just preserving the dead, they were poisoning the living. He believed those toxins could seep into the soil, leak into groundwater, and eventually end up inside us. It was a bold claim, and it made people uncomfortable. No one wants to think that their grandma's embalmed body might be contaminating the local water supply, but Lemoyne didn't just complain, he acted. In 1876, he built the very first crematory in the United States on his own property. And at the time that idea, burning a human body, it horrified people. Cremation was still viewed as something barbaric, almost sacrilegious. Many Christian leaders condemned it outright. But Lemoyne believed it was more sanitary, more respectful, and honestly, more honest. He cremated animals' first sheep, mostly to prove that it could be done safely and without disrespect. But no one really cared, until a body arrived. The first person to be cremated there was a man named Baron de Palm. He'd been embalmed already, but when he died penniless, his friend asked Lemoyne to use the crematory. And for whatever reason, curiosity, publicity, or maybe just a sense of mission, Lemoyne said yes. They brought the body by train, and when the day of the cremation came, people gathered like it was a performance. Newspapers showed up. There were crowds. Strangers came just to watch. It was morbid, sure, but it was also fascinating, and it worked. The cremation was clean controlled and oddly dignified. People were shocked by how unviolent it was, how peaceful it seemed, and slowly, public opinion began to shift. Not overnight. It took decades, but the idea started to spread. Maybe fire wasn't the enemy. Maybe cremation could be modern. Maybe it could even be meaningful. And let's be real, cremation was cheap. At the time, it cost around $25, compared to a burial which could be 4 or 5 times that. In a country where funerals were starting to bankrupt families that mattered. But of course, things never stay simple for long. As the years went on, the science that had once warned us about embalming started to shift. Studies came out saying the chemicals probably weren't poisoning the water supply after all. And people got confused, distrustful. They didn't know what or who to believe. Some stuck with traditional burials, others leaned toward cremation. But for a growing number of people, it wasn't even about morality anymore. It was about money. Because the truth is, funerals were getting more expensive. And the industry, it knew exactly what it was doing. Caskets came with upgraded linings, polished finishes, and gold-plated handles. Embalming was sold as necessary, even when it wasn't legally required. Cemeteries started charging extra for everything: plot size, headstone placement, even maintenance fees. And cremation, once the cheaper options, started getting bundled with premium urns, memorial jewelry, and personalized scattering ceremonies. Suddenly, even dying had an upsell. I think that's when people really started asking, what are we paying for? What does it mean to honor someone if the cost keeps climbing while the meaning keeps shrinking? That's not an easy question to answer, and honestly, it depends on who you ask. For some, a grand funeral is sacred. For others, it's a financial trap. But no matter where you fall, one thing is clear: the grief may be personal, but the business, that's public and powerful. And in the decades that followed, that power would only grow, reaching into small towns, buying up family-run funeral homes, and turning personal loss into corporate profit. That's where we're headed next. Chapter 8. When Grief Meets Greed. By now we've seen how death evolved from a sacred ritual to a full-blown industry. But what happens when that industry stops pretending to care? What happens when grief becomes nothing more than opportunity? That's exactly what started happening in the late 20th century. And the deeper you dig, the darker it gets. There's one company that comes up again and again in this conversation. You might not recognize the name right away, it sounds harmless enough. But Service Corporation International, or SCI, has become something of a quiet giant in the death business. A monopoly, really. They started small, like most companies do. But by the 1980s and 90s, they began buying up independent funeral homes across the country, especially in small towns. And here's the thing, they didn't change the names. They kept the old family signage, the comforting branding, the same local-sounding phone number. So if you were planning a funeral in your hometown, you'd walk into what looked like the same funeral home your parents and grandparents used. You wouldn't know it had been bought by a national corporation. You'd assume it was still local, still personal. But behind the scenes, prices were rising, services were being bundled, and upsells became standard practice. Because SCI had one goal, and it wasn't closure, it was profit. And it wasn't just them. There was another name I stumbled on that really stayed with me: Doug Cassidy. He was the head of a company called National Prearranged Services, or NPS. On paper, it sounded helpful, even compassionate. They offered prepaid funeral plans. You'd pay in advance for your funeral lock and the cost, and spare your family the stress and financial burden later. It sounded like peace of mind. A gift, really. But it was a lie. Cassidy and his team were running what was essentially a Ponzi scheme. Instead of putting customer money into secure trusts like they were legally supposed to, they funneled it into personal accounts. They paid off older funerals with new money coming in. And they used the rest for themselves: salaries, bonuses, luxury purchases, yachts, private jets, and all of it. Off the backs of grieving families. People who had done the responsible thing, who had made plans, who thought they were sparing their loved ones pain. In the end, over $400 million vanished, and when the scam was finally uncovered, it left thousands of families without the funerals they had paid for, without the goodbyes they had been promised. Cassidy and several others were convicted. They went to prison. But as usual, the punishment didn't quite match the damage. Cassidy served less than 10 years. He died in 2020 of natural causes. No headlines. No headlines for the man who had stolen from the dying. I don't know what kind of send-off he had. Maybe it was private. Maybe it was prepaid. But I hope in the quiet he was haunted by the names of the people he cheated. The ones who believed in him, the ones who deserved better. Because that's the thing we trust people in death that we wouldn't always trust in life. We hand over thousands of dollars, our deepest vulnerabilities, and the memory of someone we love, all in one breath. And we assume the people we're paying will treat that trust with care. But in an industry worth billions, care isn't always the priority. Profit is. And as the years went on, that profit grew. Not just from coffins and embalming and flowers, but from controlling the entire system. From the illusion of choice. From the way corporate hands disguised themselves in hometown faces. Death became a business. But worse, it became a brand. And most people didn't even know they were being sold to. Next, we'll talk about what that looks like today, when a funeral isn't about how you say goodbye, but how much you're willing to spend to do it. Chapter 9. Dying in the Modern Age. Choices, costs, and the illusion of control. It's strange to think about how much planning goes into our deaths, when we spend most of our lives trying not to think about dying at all. But the truth is, death today isn't what it used to be. It's not just embalming and wooden caskets anymore. Now we have options, and lots of them. Too many, maybe. In today's world, dying has become customizable. You can still go the traditional route, sure. A casket, a church service, a plot in the cemetery with your name etched in stone. That hasn't gone anywhere. But now, that's just one option on a growing menu of after-death experiences. There are companies that can turn your ashes into diamonds, actual lab-created gems you can wear on a necklace or a ring. There are businesses that will press your ashes into vinyl records so your loved ones can literally play you over and over again. You can even be launched into the sky as fireworks. I mean, imagine that your final send-off lighting up the night like the 4th of July. And to be honest, part of me gets it. There's something beautiful in the idea of going out with a bang, something that feels more you than a quiet graveside service ever could. But the other part of me, the more skeptical part, it wonders when we started turning death into a catalog of upgrades. Because none of these things are cheap. The average cost of a cremation in America today, just a simple cremation, no bells or whistles, is over $6,000. A traditional burial, that's closer to $8,000. And if you start adding things like that diamond pendant, or the high-gloss urn, or the biodegradable tripod you get planted in, the price just keeps climbing. And here's the wild part. Most people don't even know what they're paying for. They walk into a funeral home heartbroken and overwhelmed. And in that moment of vulnerability, they're handed brochures, packages, upsells, and limited-time offers for the dead. It's not a scam exactly. It's just normalized. Quietly accepted. Like, of course you need the upgraded urn. Of course you want the 24-karat memory box. After all, didn't they deserve the best? We've wrapped guilt in velvet and called it compassion. And it's not just about the money. It's about how we've started outsourcing grief, handing it off to professionals, to companies, to corporations, hoping they'll make it cleaner. Easier, less raw, but grief was never meant to be clean. It was never meant to be marketable. And yet we now live in a world where memorial packages are color-coded, where your final moments can be curated like a wedding, where death is pitched to us as an opportunity to express ourselves, one last time for a fee. It's poetic in a way, beautiful even, but also undeniably capitalistic. And I think that tension between honoring someone and performing their memory is what makes modern death so complicated. Because I don't think most people are trying to be extravagant. I think they're just scared. Scared to get it wrong. Scared to seem like they didn't care enough. Scared to face that in the end, there's no perfect way to say goodbye. And maybe that's why we keep searching. For new ways to remember, new rituals, new choices. from green burials wrapped in cotton cloth, to aquamation, which uses water instead of fire, to even newer ideas like turning your body into compost for a memorial garden. These aren't just trends. They're part of a quiet rebellion, a way to take back some control from an industry that's been profiting off our pain for decades. And maybe that's a good thing, because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the way we treat death says everything about how we value life. And right now we're at a crossroads. Do we continue down this path of polished grief and glossy price tags? Or do we remember that sometimes the most honest goodbyes are the simplest ones? Chapter 10: Legacy Loss and the Cost of Being Remembered. Sometimes I wonder what people will remember about me after I'm gone. Not in a dramatic way, just in that quiet, late-night kind of way. Will someone say my name out loud? Will a story I told live on in someone's kitchen? Or will I just disappear? It's a question that's lingered with humanity for as long as we've existed. Because when we talk about death, we're not just talking about bodies or ceremonies. We're talking about memory, about what stays behind when everything else is gone. And for centuries, we've done everything we can to hold on to that memory. We've built pyramids, etched names in stone, hung portraits on walls. We've designed rituals and monuments, all in an attempt to keep someone with us just a little bit longer. But these days, the cost of remembrance has gotten complicated. In America, if you want to be buried properly, you'll need thousands of dollars. If you want to be cremated and placed in a respectable urn, same deal. If you want something unique, a diamond, a tree, a vinyl record, it'll cost even more. And if you don't have the money, well, the truth is, you might not be remembered at all. In some parts of the country, if a body is unclaimed, if no family comes forward, if there's no money to pay for a burial or cremation, it's handed over to the county. Sometimes cremated, sometimes buried in what's called a potter's field, a graveyard for the forgotten. No marker, no service, no names. It's devastating to think about, because the way we die in this country too often comes down to economics. Not legacy, not love, just what you can afford. And yes, there are government programs that try to help. There's a Social Security death benefit for spouses, but you know what that is, $255? That's not even enough to cover the flowers, let alone the funeral. It's insulting, honestly. As if a life can be reduced to a couple $100 and a form to fill out. And yet we're told over and over that this is normal, that this is just how it works. You live, you die, you pay, or your family pays, or they go into debt trying. But maybe the real tragedy isn't the price tag, it's the fact that we've come to expect it. We've accepted that loss and debt now go hand in hand. That a goodbye has to come with financing plans. And I think that's where something gets lost, not just the person we're mourning, but the meaning behind it all. Because legacy isn't supposed to be transactional. It's supposed to be emotional. It's not about the polished casket or the marble headstone. It's about the stories that get told at the dinner table. The laugh that still echoes when someone brings up their name. The way you catch yourself doing something and realize it's because they taught you how. No corporation can sell that. No urn can contain it. No vault can protect it. In the end, we all want the same thing: to know that we mattered, that our lives had weight, that we'll be remembered not for how we were buried, but for how we lived. So maybe the question isn't how much a funeral costs. Maybe the real question is, how do we keep someone alive in memory long after they're gone? And maybe that answer has nothing to do with money at all. If there's one thing I've taken away from all this, it's that dying might be inevitable, but the way we honor that moment doesn't have to be. Whether it's a traditional burial, a green death, or something as simple as a name whispered years later. What matters most isn't how someone is laid to rest. It's how they're carried forward in the hearts and stories of those who loved them. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode resonated with you, if it made you think about someone you've lost or how you want to be remembered, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, all of them. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Echoes for more stories that linger in the quiet corners of history, the ones we live through, the ones we inherit, and the ones we often forget to question. Until next time. Take care of yourself. And remember, echoing a name is a small act of resistance against forgetting.